Hi, folks. This is Joe Firestone of Real Progressives. Tonight, we've got a very special show. David Strider, the independent candidate for Senate in the state of Washington, is going to come aboard tonight, and he's going to Q&A me for all I'm worth for the whole program. I guess I better show myself here. So I hope you can see me and I hope you can hear me. And I will put up some on-screen updates. And we'll see if we can get some comments here. And then I'll take my logo or whatever it is out of here, and I'll bring in David. There he goes. Hiya, David.
Good evening, Joe, and everybody out there.
How you doing?
Fantastic. I've been looking forward to our next time that we'd be able to speak together. And tonight's the night. And since that last meeting, a lot of questions have come to mind. And so, yeah, I'm ready for you tonight, bro.
Okay, fire away, David. Fire away.
Okay. Well, I'd like to hit on current events right now, real quick. And that is the hurricanes that we had, and especially hardest hit the Commonwealth, Puerto Rico. And I saw today in the news that the hospital ship is going to be there in a week. That's a long time, but our military could already be on station, making sure that the citizens there are taken care of. I know that it doesn't cost us any money to send our military there because they're pretty much on cruise along the East Coast, being in 2nd Marine Division, stationed in Camp Lejeune. I was aware of cruises that were within the U.S. mainland, and we could have repurposed those individuals to go there immediately as soon as the storm passed, rather than waiting days, especially when there were people that were hurt. I know that they talked about money that was going to be spent and everything else. Well, I'm thinking, what is the cost of human life? And why don't they just go and do what they have to do? And would they appropriate a new bill to do that? Well, it should be emergency funding. How would they go about doing that one? That's my first question, Joe.
Well, at some point, they are going to need to have an appropriation for this, okay, because probably FEMA, okay, is out of money by now. That it's entirely out of money, but it's had to allocate a lot for the Houston situation, and there had to be an appropriation for that. So I think there's going to have to be also an appropriation for the Caribbean. And yes, from what I understand, the amount of money they're probably going to need for Puerto Rico is probably going to be roughly comparable to Houston, or roughly 200 billion, okay, or thereabouts. So these catastrophes are requiring considerable spending. Okay. And of course, that's going to keep going on, and then people are going to become increasingly aware of the drain on our resources to actually compensate, okay, for all of the disasters, and then maybe they'll finally be willing to do something about stopping climate change. Okay, I'm getting some feedback sound, David.
Okay.
Have you got your earphones on by any chance?
I've got my, can you hear me now?
Well, I can hear you fine, but there's some
A little bit of feedback?
Some noise in the background, yeah.
Okay.
So
I know what it is.
You're fine.
I can tell you exactly what it is.
Oh, good.
I believe it's. I think I shut it off. I think, but it was.
Yeah, it does sound better now, David.
Okay, it was a fan. It's a cooling fan that allows me to tilt my laptop upwards. Easier for standing up. I found out that I'm more cognitive on my feet than sitting in a chair at night. And so, but yes, I mean, what's going on there? It's going to require lots of money, and it's going to require, you know, some forethought and just not throwing money at an issue, but actually making sure that those funds are going to the reconstruction, you know, making sure that they have the clean water, the power grid. Start considering, you know, more hurricane-resistant structures. As long as we deny climate change, like you mentioned that your last phrase, the longer we deny the climate change, the worse it's going to get for us, because even our Defense Department even talked about the biggest threat to us right now is climate change. And when you think about the billions, the trillions of dollars that are put into military bases along coastal installations that would be underwater, you know, we need to take the military's point on this here and start doing what we can to minimize the impact of climate change. It's inevitable. We've already hit that tipping point. It's just how severe is it going to be from everything that I've read.
And I think we have to do it without or with using the minimum amount of fossil fuels, because the more fossil fuels we use in trying to defend against climate change, the worse we'll be making the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and all this week on my program, I was talking about House Resolution Bill 3671, which pretty much gave a roadmap to how we could approach the move from hydrocarbon-based fuels for creating energy, propulsion, etc., and into an alternative solution. We could still have factories. We could still have all the industry that we have now. It's just a transition that we would have to make. And the bill itself has lots of things that are built into it to make sure that happens. And so anybody who gets a chance, that was on my show all this week, all 5 nights, except tomorrow night, which is Saturday. So we'll see what happens tomorrow night. But it was to emphasize the need for green technology and also how we can approach going into that new era. This is the 21st century. We should be thinking about it. We're using transmission lines that were developed, weren't put up then, but developed, you know, in the 19th century when electricity first became a thing. You know, we're still transporting it the same way. So, I mean, we're talking about, you know, we're 2 centuries behind, you know, the technology that's out there and available to us. And we need to start thinking about it.
Yes, I guess in many ways we're a developed nation now.
Yes, I'd like to think we are. Also, since I last spoke with you, we've talked about our military budget. We've talked about single payer, education, Social Security, privatization of things that we have, Social Security, Medicaid, privatization of that, privatization of the U.S. Postal Service, when that pretty much takes care of its own needs, and what Congress has done to it as far as making them fund their retirement. It looks to me like it's just another bank cache of money that Congress will appropriate somewhere down the road. So I'm just, those are some of the things that we've talked about. And so the single payer issue came up quite a bit, okay? Especially those who are Social Security recipients, Medicare recipients. And my solution was one that was readily pretty quick, and that was you have your Social Security number, which is your passport to everything the government has to offer. Because when you were born, you were issued that. If you're an old codger like me, then you had to wait and apply for one. You had to apply for it yourself. And but with that Social Security number, you're already tied in. And it's just a matter of interfacing the information that was needed to go from healthcare to retirement to any other services. Because the bank has it, you can't buy a house, you can't buy a car, you can't get a credit card without your Social Security number. And so it fits right into the single payer Medicare for all. The only thing is now is we're here tonight discussing MMT. And so how is my single payer? I mean, would we still have small monthly premiums that would be paid for by the single person or the family? Would they be able to bring that price down considerably? And would there be a copay when we go to get our prescriptions? How would MMT help us achieve that goal of that single payer?
Okay, well, you have to remember that, okay, it's not a question of MMT directly here. Okay, it's a question of policy, which is based on the principles, okay, of MMT, or the ideas, okay, of MMT. Okay, now MMT is concerned, of course, with both the lack of any solvency problem, okay, the ability of the government to spend as it likes from the solvency point of view, okay, but also the need to calibrate the spending of the government in such a way that you have a rate of inflation which is close to zero. In other words, the MMT goals are many with respect to public purpose, but in the areas of employment, the goal is full employment or zero unemployment. Okay, where zero unemployment means, okay, that everybody wants a job, is able to get one, is able to find one in the federal program, and where zero inflation means, well, specifically zero inflation. In other words, in MMT, there's no fooling around. It's not 4% inflation or 3% inflation, okay, or 2% inflation.
Okay.
But the public purpose goal is actually zero inflation. Okay. And in fact, the preferred policy for the MMT writers with respect to the Federal Reserve is to follow a zero federal funds rate policy all the time, okay, and allow the interest rates, okay, to be adjusted by fiscal policy. Okay, so you take care of inflation with fiscal policy, and you take care, okay, of unemployment with fiscal policy too, and you take care of growth, okay, with fiscal policy, and pretty much what the Fed, what the MMTers, okay, many MMT writers anyway, would like the Fed to do is just to maintain a zero interest rate policy, okay, for the overnight rate. Okay? So those are the goals. Okay, now, once you get to Washington, however, you may find that the practical politicians want to compromise those goals in some way. Perhaps they want to have the Fed continue, the Treasury to continue to issue debt instruments. Okay. There are some in MMT who would like that, even though they favor a zero interest rate or pretty close to it before those instruments, but they still want to have a risk-free investment where people can park their funds. Okay, that is actually provided by the Treasury Department. Okay, I'm still getting feedback from your end, David.
Okay, let me see what I can. Let me see what I can do here. Is that any better? Is that any better?
Yeah, that's a little better.
Okay, I'm gonna try something else too.
Okay.
Now, is that
Okay,
any better? Is that
yeah,
better?
Yeah, that seems to be better, David.
Okay, I know what the problem was.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. Okay, great. Okay, so the other alternative, which is favored by some of the MMTers, or seems to be favored, okay, by some of the MMTers, is that you don't use debt instruments, okay, but if the Federal Reserve wants to maintain a non-zero interest rate for some reason, that what the Federal Reserve should do then is to pay interest on the reserves at the Federal Reserve. Okay, in other words, the Federal Reserve can set an interest rate, and that interest rate can be the interest rate that they pay on the account balances of the reserves that are resident at the Federal Reserve. Okay, and the Treasury doesn't have to be involved in actually maintaining a particular interest rate. Okay, and it doesn't have to offer the risk a free investment. Functionally, the Fed can offer that investment just through the reserves resident at the Fed that it pays interest on. Okay, now that's not quite the same thing because there are some people who are not able to keep any deposits at the Fed itself, but who could buy Treasury bonds. Okay, but that can be easily fixed, but just by allowing anybody who wishes to have an account at the Fed.
Yeah, yeah.
So that can be fixed also.
Right. It kind of, that kind of reminds me of interest paid by my bank, on my savings account.
Oh yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah,
yeah, that's what it is. It's essentially the same.
Yeah, it's a percentage, and it's every month I get to put my 2 cents in. So it's.
Okay, so the details. Okay, so to get back to the main point, okay, the details of what happens even in an MMT-based system, are largely, okay, that a system which is using MMT-based knowledge for policy, what actually goes on is still going to vary depending upon the political issues and the political judgments that are made by the legislators. And often these will be confounded with their communication judgments. Okay, in other words, if they feel that they can present a convincing case to the public by going really flat out in terms of MMT principles, then do that. Okay, but in other cases where they don't feel they can educate, they will compromise what the MMTers would like to do, according to their political needs. So these practical things are always going to go on, okay, and to enter the situation. It probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference as long as the compromises are not too great and as long as the legislators are actually legislating for public purpose to the best of their ability to do so.
Correct.
Okay, but there has to be some degree of the freedom here for the politicians to operate. Now, going back to the question of the funding, okay, of Medicare for all, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the funding for everything takes place in the same way. That is, it comes down to the Congress actually appropriating the funds through the appropriations bills of Congress or through combination bills that do the authorization and also the appropriation at the same time. Okay, because there are some of those bills also. Okay, and those essentially mandate the spending and give the Treasury the authority to fill its accounts for spending. Okay. Okay, so then it becomes a matter of what rules the Treasury follows to get the money into its account. Okay, so the way politics comes in here is that people think in terms of how much will the appropriations be? How much will it cost? How much will be spent on the Medicare for All program? And they ask the question, will more be spent than is spent now for medical care? And if so, will there be taxes levied? Okay. Mm-hmm. So one thing the people in favor of a Medicare for All bill have been saying, and I believe that they're largely right. In fact, I mean, when I say largely right, I mean they all believe that the total amount, okay, of medical spending we have now under the present situation, which is $3.4 trillion per year, will substantially fall if we have a Medicare for All program. Now, some people think that our expenditures may fall by $600 billion per year, which would bring them in at $2.8 trillion per year. Some people think, okay, as I do, that they'll be cut actually by 1/3, which would bring them in at 2.2 to 2.3 trillion. I heard Stephanie Kelton give an estimate on a podcast she appeared on this week, saying that she expected the spending to fall to the same level as the average of the OECD nations, okay, the OECD nations, which would be approximately 1/2 of what we're spending now, wow, which would bring the spending down to $1.7 trillion per year. Now, at $1.7 trillion per year, total medical spending, funded almost entirely by the federal government, there would be no higher taxes than we have now. The federal taxes might go up a little bit, but the state taxes would go down by a corresponding amount because the states would no longer be paying, okay, for any of the medical spending. They would be totally replaced by the federal government in most of the Medicare for All bills that I've seen thus far. If expenditures were cut by 1/3, then it seems to me the federal government would have to spend $600 or $700 billion more than it is spending now. But even if that was done through taxing people, people would still be saving out of pocket a considerable amount, because the 3.4 trillion that is being spent right now is all coming out of our pockets in one sense or another. There is no deficit spending connected to our medical care spending. So either it goes out of our pockets to the insurance companies, or it goes out of our pockets in the form of the copays and also deductibles, or it goes out of our pockets in taxes to the federal and state, and local governments. But there's no deficit spending attached to that at all. So if the expenditures go down even only to 2.8 trillion, people will still be saving money.
Right.
If they go down to 2.2 or 2.3 trillion, they'll be saving on the average 1/3 of what they're spending now. And if it went down to half, they'd be saving half of what their total spending is now on medical care on the average. So to say that it's a good deal for people is the understatement of the year. And that doesn't even take into account that they would be getting much better medical care, that all the records from the nations that have a Medicare for All program show that the health care in those nations is better, and that it is reflected in life expectancy, which in some cases, in other words, between the United States and Canada right now, the life expectancy difference is 3 to 4 years in favor of Canada. And compared to Japan right now, the United States is 6 years behind Japan in life expectancy. I mean, I don't know if we realize that. I don't know if our people recognize that number, but I mean, that is just astonishing. It's just astounding.
One good thing about having the universal health care, the single payer, Joe, is this: people will not be spending all of their available dollars on medication or health care. They'll be able to start going to the doctor. They'll be able to start getting healthier. They'll be able to have a healthier regime when it comes to nutrition. They'll be able to eat better foods. They'll be able to eat better foods, not that filled with lots of fat and salts and things of that nature. I mean,
yes,
I like a fatty food every now and then, but it's a splurge thing. It's like I'm there at the checkout and it's a 25-cent bag of potato chips. I've had my splurge. I don't need any more because I'm healthy eating. I'm eating healthy, and so my life choices as far as what I want for nutrition is better. I'm getting better nutrition, therefore I'm healthier. And by increasing our life expectancy to that of other nations, and maybe even surpassing in some cases, is the increased productivity that we as seniors get to have and enjoy, and be able to give back to the younger generation. I mean, that still gives us that ability to be more productive, even up into the bitter end. But in this case, everybody will be healthier and everything, and hey, I'll see you on the other side type thing.
Yeah, right. It may not be such a bitter end.
That's right.
Okay. In other words, the end could be a far more pleasant end than we experience now, because some of the uglier of the diseases we get may not actually enter into the picture in quite the same way.
So true. So true.
So there's all of that to consider. Okay, now there is, I think, there are, among the MMTers themselves, competing considerations about whether the impact of such a bill would be inflationary or deflationary. Okay, in the case of Warren Mosler, who's one of the leading MMTers, the person who made the first synthesis that's recognized, okay, as MMT.
Okay.
He feels rather strongly that there's a danger of deflation because of all the jobs that will be lost in the insurance industry. Not just the jobs directly lost in the insurance industry, but also the secondary jobs and the tertiary jobs that in some way support life activities. Okay.
Right, like the debt collectors. Like the debt collectors.
Yes.
They'll probably suffer the worst. But I think that, you know, our society is such, and if we're able to continue to grow, I mean, with people having more dollars in their pocket because of better health care, okay, what's going to happen is the supply and demand for products are going to increase. And I think that inflationary trends, we could maintain pretty much a zero inflation and maintain it for a long time. And I say that because you've got new dollars coming into the system, you know, from end users like myself and you and those listening. We've got more dollars going into the system, and there's no reason to increase the price. I mean, I know what it was like when I was a young man. It seemed like the price, you know, never changed. I mean, as far as, you know, for food and automobiles were like $1,500, $2,000 for the longest time. I mean, so, I mean, I don't think that it would be deflationary. I think it would maintain our supply and demand. It would increase supply and demand, therefore increasing other jobs in other fields for that supply and demand, the logistics and everything else. And those people affected by the single payer issue, those administrators, et cetera, would be able to go into these other fields and still apply their skills across the board into other industries and regiments. So I don't think there would be that great a loss, you know, as they started gearing up and started taking this and dismantling that insurance portion. I think that there would be a transitional period that would be there, and that we should have to, you know, you talked about employment for all, and I agree with that. And so during that transitional period, those who would be without jobs would be able to have the ability to draw some form of unemployment compensation while the jobs were being recreated and the new things were happening, such as, you know, in the green technology and also in healthcare. When you talk about 350 million Americans going on healthcare, that's a bundle. So there's going to be federal employment available too to those people.
Okay, well, here's what I think. Okay, well, first, what I'll do is mention what Stephanie Kelton thinks.
Okay.
She thinks no one really knows the impact. And the reason why is that people haven't really looked at it carefully from a modeling standpoint yet. And especially from a modeling standpoint that does not incorporate the neoliberal types of assumptions. Okay, which is what you must do, okay, in order to gauge the impact of this. And I believe she's right about that, but I also have some hunches as to how this would go, okay, you know, from my perspective. Okay, the first hunch, okay, is based on the idea that but the money we spend now on healthcare will not be going out of the system. It still remains in the economy, but it remains in our pockets. And that the real comparison is whether that money remains in our pockets or whether that money goes to the upper reaches of the health insurance establishments that have been one of the types of industries extracting wealth okay, for most of the other people. Now, we know that the wealth of the extractors, okay, the wealth extractors who make very, very large salaries and profits do not consume those at the same rate, okay, that people who are not as well off consume. What they do instead is that they save and they remove demand from the private sector. Okay? So their removal of demand from the private sector is actually deflationary and is one reason why we have a stagnant sort of economy today. So it seems to me that just allowing those funds to remain in the hands of people who will consume is likely to be more inflationary than our present system to begin with. Secondly, as you said, there will be many more jobs appearing in the public sector for people who have to leave the health insurance sector. If there are 650,000 jobs in that sector, and they are replaced by, let's say, an additional 200,000 federal employees who are doing the administration of the expanded Medicare for All program, then we don't have quite as big an employment problem. Okay, but also the increasing demand from the private sector due to the fact that the money is now in the hands of consumers is also going to have the effect that it will result in the employment of a considerable portion of the remaining, let's say, 400 to 450,000 insurance company employees. Okay. And then there's also multiplier effects in the secondary parts of the economy or the tertiary parts of the economy as well, which we have to take account of, which are going to raise demand and will likely to create still more jobs. But then there are other factors that I think Warren is not considering. One of these factors is that what happens if we don't decrease total medical care spending by 1/2, but we only decrease it by 2/3. Now, in terms of the latest spending figures that I've seen, okay, and they may be off here, the federal and state governments are now spending a total of 1.7 trillion or so per year. So let's say that our spending, total spending, is decreased to 2.3 trillion or 2.4 trillion or something like that. Then we're talking about the federal government having to spend an additional 600 to 700 billion, okay, to make up the difference. Now, if the particular legislation that's passed should make the choice to deficit spend that 600 or 700 billion, then that sort of deficit spending, $700 billion a year, okay, in deficit spending with the combined primary, secondary, okay, and tertiary multiplier between 2.6 and 3.0, I'm talking about now the fiscal multiplier, you're going to have a tremendous addition to GDP just from that. And that's going to be very expansionary. Okay? I won't say that it's going to cause inflation, because I think there's an awful lot of slack in the economy now, and we don't know how much the economy will be able to soak up, okay, to absorb. But I do think the number of jobs created is going to be more than enough to compensate for the insurance company jobs, okay, that are lost. And if we are wise enough, to also spend on a job guarantee program at the same time,
yeah,
we will surely have a full employment situation that may be somewhat inflationary in the short run, but that, according to MMT principles themselves, will quickly stabilize over a period of 2 or 3 years, and then will exert a salutary deflationary effect.
Mm-hmm.
You still have a lot of feedback.
Right. Oh, okay. Maybe I'm too close to it. I've turned down everything I can on my side, Joe. Maybe next time I will go and use a set of headphones. That may help a little bit. I notice you've got a set of headphones, and
yeah, what I have are the
headphone microphone.
Right. Okay. The headphone microphone, okay, are Apple's.
Oh, okay.
In other words, these are the ones I got with the iPad. Okay.
Oh, okay.
And it works fine in the PC. Okay. If you plug it into one of the ports of the PC, it works fine both as a headphone, okay, and a microphone. And it really cuts off the feedback effect. And even at the Apple store, I think these only go for $19 or $20.
Yeah, I have a set that I keep in the car when I got the Bluetooth on. And it, Teresa, it is not the printer. My printer's not active right now. It is, I'm using a Hewlett Packard desktop, and it's a POS. And, I'll never buy another. I had a desktop HP back when they were a good system. But I went on that assumption that the laptop would be just as good. My wife, she uses an Acer, and I have a Lenovo here that I haven't fired up yet either. But I think I'm going to change
the one I use is a Dell, and I don't think that's a particularly great computer either.
Well, it's the hardware and the software that's loaded up into the machine. And I think that HP kind of went cheap on this one here, this particular model. Now, I could be wrong with the other models, but this particular model here has caused me not to want to buy another HP. Okay. I like the Acer, and I like the Dell, and I like the Lenovo, but it's just that this one here I've had for 3 years now. And anyway, I apologize for any feedback that may be occurring.
Okay. Well, we will try to get through it today as best we can. Okay. So, next question.
The next question. Here this past week, our Senate appropriations, our senators and congressmen, they, especially the two here from Washington State, approved almost an $800 billion defense spending. And
I know
that every time that our defense budget goes up, we're headed for war. It just seems to be that way. We notice that there's been an increase in troops going back into Afghanistan and into the Middle East too. And why don't we just pull out? And while we're pulling out, why don't we just, since we have boots on the ground, why don't we light up those opium fields, those poppy fields? Why don't we light up those poppy fields and just burn them to a crisp on our way out? Since we have a opioid problem here and heroin problem here in the United States, why don't we just get rid of some of it while we're going out, since we know where they're at? But our military, it seems to be spending a whole lot of money. Now, my point is the Veterans Administration doesn't get that kind of money.
I know.
But I think that the veterans, I mean, if there's a defense budget of $800 billion, the VA should get 25% of that budget that was given to the military and put into the VA on top of what the VA is already allowed. All these horror stories that we get from the VA, Joe, I get veterans health care. I get veterans health care. I've never had a problem. In fact, I had something I wanted to share with everybody tonight. My VA, my primary caregiver, and we spoke about my tobacco usage, and I needed to get rid of it. I mean, I am tired of smoking, but it is a nasty addiction. Nicotine is probably one of the worst legalized substances in our drug schedule.
Yeah, yes, and, I know that myself. Okay, I used to smoke.
Yeah.
However,
so
my wife and I went off it in 1988. It will soon be 30 years.
I could still be running 3 miles in under 28 minutes if I got off it then, Joe. I could still be doing that. Yes, Gina Queen, I will get Maria out. She voted against the people in Bernie back in 2016. Yes, thank you for that compliment, and thank you for that encouragement. But no, my doctor, I told her I needed help, and that is one thing that I can say about the veterans health care, okay? And that is that we need more funding for the VA, okay?
Well, I certainly agree with you.
And the fact that
could not agree with you more. And we have to take care of our own.
And the veterans who are not receiving health care, I mean, I think that every veteran should, if they have an honorable discharge, a DD-214 that says even general discharge under honorable conditions, they need to get into the Veterans Administration. They should not be prohibited from signing into the veterans health care. I think that if you put your life on the signature and you took the oath, that the VA should be helping you if you have no other form of health care. Okay? And that's how I feel about it. And that's why I think that the funding should be, and I think that the outrageous money that we spend on our military, how does that affect us overall as far as a nation and our ability to provide health care for our veterans? And with that, I don't want it to fall into the single payer thing, because I think that single payer, they see gunshot wounds from, activity created by law enforcement. They see those kind of things, but when it comes to military accidents and stuff, those doctors in the VA are the only ones who are, in my opinion, qualified, because they've actually seen it, they've been there, and everything else. And yes, I do, Teresa. I do have a Facebook page, just Dave Strider for U.S. Senate, and on Facebook, and it'll bring you to my page. Thank you. But I think that many times, Joe, that there is, we spend too much money on our defense, and our veterans are left behind. And so how can we, using the principles that we have talked about, is this also through the appropriations, and how can we repurpose some of those funds that go there? And does the Defense Department actually need all those billions of dollars to operate on a yearly basis? That's my next question.
Okay, I don't think that's related to MMT, okay, as much as it's related to our foreign policy. Now, at this point, we have a very aggressive type of foreign policy. We rely very heavily on, military solutions, or proposed military solutions, that turn out not to be solutions at all. And it's quite clear, if you look at the record over the period of the last certainly 20 to 25 years, okay, that our military interventions have been largely unsuccessful. They've been breeding far more enemies than we've been successful in killing.
Mhm.
It's just we're in a. If we look at this just in terms of uh, success in actually pacifying various areas, our problems now are far worse than they were in the year 2000. In other words, if you date this, okay, from what happened to the coal in the Middle East,
Yes.
in the I think that happened in 2000, okay, or in 1999, and you look at the situation from that date forward, we're looking at a continuous worsening of our situation.
Mhm.
We got Osama bin Laden, but
Yes.
that didn't end, okay, Islamic fundamentalism. Nothing we've done, okay, has put an end to that. It's obvious the root cause of that is the fact that we are in the Middle East, in their lands,
Yes.
and we do not belong there. We have to let them settle their own problems. And if they stray out of their areas to try to kill us, then perhaps there's a place for specific expeditions that are punitive, okay, in character.
Right.
But for the most part, we need to stay out of their nations.
Absolutely. That's my feeling too, Joe. One of the viewers on tonight just said that they didn't think that I got the MMT thing. And to be quite honest with you, Joe, by you describing and us discussing the Veterans Administration and the military budget, I know where I think MMT would really benefit this nation, and that would be in the single payer, in our education, the jobs for all, zero unemployment. I think that, those are the areas that I would like to explore more and know more about, because I'm pretty sure that the military is pretty much a political thing.
Okay, I think that you have to have a general principles kind of understanding, okay, of MMT, David, okay, and essentially what it means, okay, and what it does, okay, and what it can do.
That's what I want, Joe. That's what I want, Joe.
On policy. Okay, so let me review that, okay, for a minute. Okay.
Certainly, please do.
Okay. Well, first of all, the government creates all of the high-powered money in the system. Okay, most of it is created through the Federal Reserve, filling treasury accounts, and then that money, that high-powered money, is spent into the system as essentially net financial assets. Okay. Okay. So now, okay, once that money gets into the system, there are two main sources of leakages, okay, of that money. One source of leakage is into savings, where the money is not consumed, so that it reduces demand. Okay. Okay. And the other is to net imports. If we have a net import situation, in other words, where the imports, okay, exceed our exports, okay, then we have our dollars that are flowing to the bank accounts, okay, of other nations that may not be spent here or may not be spent at all. In other words, they might be sitting at the Fed, in savings accounts, okay, reserve accounts at the Fed in the trillions of dollars. Okay, and they are generally held onto. They're not spent into the United States economy. So let's say the total shortfall is running at roughly 10%. 10% of GDP. So that's going to mean that the level of demand in our economy is falling by 10% because of that, because our savings desires are not being met and our import desires, okay, are not being met. So that reduces domestic activity produced by demand by roughly 10%, okay, of GDP under what our potential was. Now, if the federal government does not make up that 10% of GDP, but through deficit spending, then the consequence is that we grow at a far lower rate than we could have grown. And the consequences also exist in terms of the unemployment that we see in our economy and in terms of a loose labor market instead of a tight labor market, which reduces wages all across the system and which over time creates growing inequality in our country, which has effects in terms of the misery of people, of course, the hardships of people, but also political power, class power, elite power versus people power in the economy. When that goes on for years and years and years. However, the gap, okay, between what the potential demand is and the actual demand is, or what the potential GDP is, okay, and what the actual GDP is, represents what we call policy space, which the federal government is not actually using. So right now, okay, let's say we had people fulfilling their savings desires, okay, and their import desires, okay, as well. Then the shortfall might well amount to 12%, okay, of GDP. We have a GDP of 18.5 trillion right now. Okay. So 12% of that is what? $2.3 trillion or something like that. How much are we deficit spending? 650 billion. So we're looking at policy space of 1.7 trillion, which is unused. That's the gap.
Yes.
That MMT tells us we can fill. In other words, it roughly says we can fill that gap with 1.7 trillion more in deficit spending if we cared to. Okay, and that will get us much closer to a full employment economy, a full potential economy than we are right now. Now that figure might be wrong. We might reach the demand pull inflation point before we get to the 1.7 trillion, perhaps 1.5 trillion. It might be wrong because it undershoots. It might be really 1.9 trillion space we have, or 2 trillion space we have. I don't know what the figure actually is, okay? But no one does. It depends on how the economy cycles around as we add deficit spending to it. We will see it, though, at some point. We will stabilize it, and we will have a very good idea of what the policy space is that we have to fill up. Okay, so MMT tells us then how much space we have for spending, for additional spending each year, okay, above what we are spending now. And that is very useful information to have. Now, that tells us how much spending room we have, but that spending room will vary in part with whether the spending is wise spending or not, whether it really expands the economy up to the potential of the economy. If that spending is directed towards the rich in the form of tax cuts for the rich, then we know the fiscal multiplier is very small for that. So we know we won't be exhausting our policy space at all. We won't be using the full potential. Okay, the rich people will continue to accumulate money and increase the inequality, but they're not going to put that money to work, okay, for the economy. Yes. So if we direct it that way, we're directing it in the wrong way. Now, exactly. We might also direct it to growth, to rapid growth, but that might not actually necessarily be good, because the kind of growth that we direct it towards might be growth that has a very bad impact on the environment and our climate change problems. And that would not be to the good either, because that would mean that we'd be getting into side effects that in the long run create an unsustainable growth economy. So we need to spend that money, to use that additional policy space, not simply to create a full employment and low inflation kind of economy, but we also have to spend it to create a sustainable economy. Absolutely, that's of enormous importance to our futures. We have to consider not just the immediate impact of the spending, but the medium-term impact and the longer-term impact of the spending, because we have no more time to screw around with regard to climate change. We've had 50 years of warning on this stuff now, and we have failed to adapt. That's the truth of the matter. We're out of time now. We've got to adapt or die. That's where it is. Okay?
Yes.
Okay, so, but that's not what MMT tells us. What MMT tells us is about the policy space for spending, the macro economics of it. The microeconomics impact is not something derivable from the MMT principles. We have to estimate that from models that not only deal with macro kinds of considerations, but with general economic impact considerations on other sectors of the economy and the political system. So our models have to be much more complex. The economic thinking that we engage in can't be just economic thinking. It has to be whole systems thinking that considers the ecological impact, the environmental impact, the energy impact, the climate impact, the educational impact, the political system impact, the distributional impact. All these things have to come into our consideration. Okay? So that's where MMT fits. That's what it can do for us, and that's what it can't do for us also. I mentioned a lot of things it can't do for us. So we have to do more than MMT here. Mm-hmm. And the MMTers, insofar as they're just focusing on the MMT aspects, can't really advise us of that. Now, many of the MMTers now, an increasing number, are very much involved in sustainability considerations, not just MMT considerations.
Right. I'm concerned about sustainability as well, because right. I think that in order to make something work, Joe, we have to have something that's going to sustain us. We have to make sure that what we do isn't thrown to the wind.
Yes.
We have to make sure that it has fruit.
We have to make sure that we use the policy space in the right way relative to all the goals of public purpose, not just employment and not just price stability, but all the variety of goals that go into public purpose. So one of the things we badly need, which we've tried to provide, okay, at RP, is a broad conception of public purpose involving something like 41 dimensions, okay, of public purpose now that should go into our policy calculations. That is, what's the impact on all of these dimensions, okay, of public purpose, not just on employment and inflation.
Okay.
Okay.
But see, I realize, Joe, that there's a lot that I think I mentioned in our first time together that when I get to Washington, D.C., I'm going to need people like you to help me understand what is going to be good for budgetary or appropriations, what I can plug into, and something that I'll be able to put together a very good budget program for the nation, whether it's accepted or not. But those type of things, so that I understand how that is done. I want to be able to have people like yourself, giving me that advice, helping me spend the people's money better. And that's, I have a lot to learn, sir. I have a lot to learn. But
okay,
I do know.
I would certainly be available to help.
Thank you.
Okay, in terms of the macroeconomic stuff. However, I am 78 now. Okay, and I don't think that I'm in the market for a full-time congressional job, because I know those are 18-hour-a-day jobs.
Well, if I were to contact you for advice, it would be privately, and we'd be able to end the conversation whenever we wanted to. Or, Dave, I got to go. Wife's got dinner for me. It's time for a snack. Those kind of things. I wouldn't tie you up, but I value your understanding and your knowledge of this principle and how it affects our federal budget and how we appropriate what we need as a nation for the people. And to be quite honest with you, sir, I don't think that need for the people it's being met. And
I completely agree. I think we completely agree on that.
And perhaps that is where I need to strike the iron with the hottest temperature possible, and that is to make sure that the people, not just here in Washington State, but decisions that I make on the Senate floor, voting or contesting, it affects the whole nation. So I need to make sure that I have my finances, but I also know what's right and wrong, but as far as making sure that the money is spent, that our nation has at its disposal, is spent the right way and not just thrown to the wind or given to someone else, who's going to sit on it, as you mentioned earlier. I'd like to see more industry come about this nation, and I don't know how we could do that, but I think that's a whole lot better.
Okay, I just got a comment.
Yes, sir.
Offline from somebody on Facebook, okay, but not as part of our particular interview here today.
Okay.
Suggesting that you didn't really quite understand what I had to say about MMT in terms of.
I saw that same message, sir.
Oh, you saw that message.
I saw that message. It popped up, and that's
Okay.
why I
Well,
started.
I'm not sure about that, but what she wanted me to convey to you, okay, in which I did not actually do, okay, in this session, but I think I previously conveyed that to you, is that the federal government can spend as much as it wants, as long with the only constraint actually being the inflation constraint.
Yes, I
Now,
remember that.
as it happens, I do not think that is true. And I think the person who made that particular comment is really mistaken about it. She heard very recently one of the MMT leaders saying that, okay, or agreeing with someone who said that. And she, okay, is echoing that. But the truth is, if we're concerned with legislating for public purpose, then inflation is only one of our constraints. A second constraint is also whether we're legislating for sustainability or not, or whether we're legislating for social justice or not, or whether we're legislating, okay, for economic justice or not, or whether we're legislating for law enforcement justice. There are many dimensions, okay, of public purpose that ought to provide constraints on our spending. Inflation is certainly a very, very important constraint, but it is not the only constraint provided, which exists for people who are attempting to legislate for public purpose. Okay, and I don't think that many of the MMTers would accept the idea that inflation is the only constraint. For example, I don't think Randy Ray would say that. I don't think Pavlina Chernyeva would say that. I don't think Bill Mitchell would say that. Okay, I'm not going to say who said it. I think the person who said it was in a casual conversation with someone and was trying to agree with that person and not be disagreeable, by disagreeing.
Right.
And that the MMTer had gotten their main point across, and they didn't want to rock the boat in that particular situation. My situation here with you, okay, is different. It's more of a pedagogical situation. Okay, so I can tell you what I think the truth actually is. Okay, I think the truth is, by the way, okay, that inflation, is not even an absolute constraint. Okay, in other words, if we have a multidimensional concept of public purpose, then we have to agree that if we're looking at the outcomes, okay, the impacts, okay, in general, okay, the whole variety, okay, of impacts, okay, that then we might want to experience, okay, a little bit of inflation if, say, we could get a greater amount of sustainability.
Right.
While having that. Or we might want to experience, okay, a little bit of inflation as long as we could get a greater amount of social justice from that. I mean, I'm not, exactly here prepared to specify what the compromises might be, but I know that in multidimensional situations, there are always trade-offs, and that inflation is only one of the goals of public purpose. And while we don't want to have a runaway style, okay, of inflation, we might well want to tolerate a certain amount, okay, of inflation if it facilitates having other goals. For example, in World War II, we pretty well controlled inflation here in the United States, but we tolerated some inflation in wartime to facilitate our wartime goals. And that was just part of the wartime situation. Okay? And we got rid of wage and price controls soon after the war ended because we wanted to have other kinds of benefits in the economy. And so we tolerated for a time a greater amount of inflation. Now, that kind of thing is going to go on all the time within the broader conception, okay, of public purpose. Now, Stephen Hale points out, okay, a very accomplished person in the MMT area, says, if you ensure ecological sustainability, then inflation can be a useful signal that you face structural problems within the economy which need to be addressed.
You know how I address something like that, Joe? I like to prepare. What you've said tonight here with the inflation thing is that we could prepare for worst case scenario and be prepared for it. I always find that in my life that when I prepare for the worst case scenario that could happen to me, and it doesn't happen to me because the path that I was on continued to move forward, but the other thing didn't happen, I'm prepared for that if it were to happen. And in the same thing with inflation or things of that nature, knowing that it could happen, if we were prepared for it with things that we could do to counter or, curb it, we'd be prepared for it. And knowing that that could occur, having those stopgaps would be beneficial, knowing that that could happen in that inflationary jump that would occur if it occurred. Is that right? Being ready? I mean, I like being ready myself.
Okay. Okay. Well, to a certain extent, okay, it's certainly right. I think that some of the things, okay, that MMTers would do would build in automatic stabilizers.
Okay.
In order to actually control inflation. The job guarantee is such an automatic stabilizer in the long run. In other words, at first, the impact of the job guarantee would be to expand our economy very greatly because the minimum wage is far lower than a living wage. If we raised it to a living wage, it would have a tremendous impact on the economy and might cause a bit of inflation here and there. Okay, but in the longer run, the living wage actually serves as a price anchor in the economy so that when good times come and business starts to get too enthusiastic and starts to bid where we see workers trying to bid the price of labor up, that the job guarantee tends to pull things down again. Okay, and so that's one of the stabilizers, but there can be other automatic stabilizers. Like there could be certain conditions under which we bring in wage and price controls. Mm-hmm. There could be long-term forecasting, which allows us to predict where there will be supply shortages in the economy, where we would get cost push type of inflation. while we're increasing demand if we're not very careful. Okay, because while we might not have a general demand pull type of inflation, when demand is going up very, very fast, it could cause supply problems in certain restricted areas. In a way, that's what happened during the 1970s when the Arabs started increasing the price of oil. Okay, then we had a cost push type of inflation, okay, going on, which we misinterpreted as a demand pull type of inflation.
Yeah, it was. I remember that. I remember that period of our history. Active Marine Corps. Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur War.
Yeah, the Yom Kippur War at first, okay, but then in the late 70s, it wasn't actually the OPEC as a whole that was causing the cost push on inflation. It was the Saudis, because the Saudis had taken over leadership in the market. They were the price setters.
Yes.
And they wanted to keep their profits high while conserving their oil. And so they pushed the prices up, okay, at that time. Simultaneously, Jimmy Carter tried to relax the situation by finding new sources of supply. But they took years to kick in. It was essentially, he did this, okay, through the deregulation, okay, of natural gas. He was not the beneficiary of that. It was Ronald Reagan, okay, he was the beneficiary of that. Okay, but that's what happened, okay. Carter's move was eventually successful. Unfortunately, it failed to benefit him. We would have been a lot better off as a society today had it done so. Okay, but anyway, according to Stephen Hale, I have his comment up there. He says, inflation and ecological sustainability are the constraints. The other issues you're discussing are objectives to be pursued and achieved rather than constraints on total spending. I'm not sure I understand that particular distinction. As I say, there are many different goals that we're pursuing at the same time with our policies. And what we prioritize and what we do not prioritize depends on us, okay, depends on the value judgments, okay, that we make. Now, no doubt, inflation, price stability, okay, and ecological sustainability are very important goals. I'd argue ecological sustainability is the overriding goal. And in that sense, okay, it is a constraint on spending, or we certainly ought to make it one, okay? But I'm not sure inflation comes in second. In other words, I'm not sure inflation comes in ahead of social justice, okay? Or ahead, okay, of economic justice, or ahead of a greater degree, okay, of equality. As long as inflation is not too high, I'm not sure I see a problem with some degree of inflation, but I want to be careful about this. That depends on how we define inflation.
Yes.
We define inflation in the sense, okay, of Bill Mitchell, then I think that Stephen Hale, okay, is right. We cannot have inflation. But if we define inflation in the common sense way, okay, that people happen to look at it, which is in terms of increases in the CPI, whether the constant levels of increase or not, then I think in common sense terms, when people are speaking, okay, of inflation, that we could probably tolerate some constant increases in price levels, okay, from year to year. For example, I've seen Randy Ray write about the situation in Turkey for a number of years, okay, where inflation actually averaged 6% a year or something like that in terms of constant price increases, okay, from year to year. And the way he viewed it, it was not a problem for the economy in Turkey. Turkey, okay, was rapidly developing, okay, at that time. And it seemed like the economy was operating fine despite that level of price increases, okay, from year to year, because the price increases were not accelerating, because they were constant price increases. And so the economy was able to adjust to that level, okay, of price increase. So in part, I think the truth of Stephen's statement depends on how one chooses to define inflation, and also on the values that one places on the various goals that are part of our theory of public purpose. Okay. Anyway, let's go on with this. Okay, we probably have also more comments as we go along. So did you have other questions?
Pretty much, I needed to have a clarification, on one. I know what I want to do when I go to the Senate. I know that here we have progressives that are pushing for single payer. I have congressional people here in the state of Washington and everywhere that are talking about the education and free college, that type of stuff, similar to what is available in some European countries. And so, I mean, there are things that they're moving on, and so there are things that, one, I want to make sure that when I talk about, yes, we can have, or there's no reason why we shouldn't, that I can back it up with the ability to go and make sure that those funds are duly appropriated, so that those programs can become reality. And
okay, well, one of the things, okay, I've noticed about you is that when you get on to talk about your campaign, okay, and your desire to serve, that you talk about the policies that you want to see enacted and the issues that you see that we have to face. You're not talking about personalities. There's really not very much about your own personality, and there's not very much about the personality, okay, of others. And you're not attempting to bash your rivals in the Senate campaign by talking about their personal characteristics. You're always addressing yourself to the issues. And I greatly admire that. I think that's what a candidate should be doing. And I think you try to tell the truth about those issues. And I think that's also what a candidate ought to be doing. And I think you're trying to legislate for people. And again, I also think that's what people ought to be doing. That's why I said in my title of this particular broadcast that you're not one of them, that you are one of ours. Okay, that's why I said that. And that was brought home. Okay, and that was brought home very strongly to me when you did your broadcast on the Puerto Rico situation. I saw the passion in that, I saw the emotion in that, and I saw the commitment to do something about our own. And your realization that the Puerto Ricans were Americans, that they are our own. Now, today I had a 15-minute video early in the day, roughly at 1 o'clock, okay, or thereabouts. 12:45, I guess it started. It was a short video. It was only 15 minutes. And basically, what I did was I gave a speech. And I gave an easy solution to the Puerto Rican problem in terms of filling the Treasury account with the $200 billion that would be needed to solve the Puerto Rican problem. But I went actually way, way beyond that, because I talked about Donald Trump actually minting a $100 trillion coin and placing it in the Mint's public enterprise fund account, which would actually be the first stop of that money at the Fed. It only gets into the Treasury spending account at a later time when the Treasury sweeps the Mint's account for the seniorage. Okay, but anyway, I suggested he do that. And I gave him the actions in that post. And I also gave him a speech to use. I wanted to be as helpful, as I could be. But I addressed the problem from the same point of view as your own. Now, of course, the $100 trillion going into the Treasury spending account, or into the Mint's account first, and from then on into the Treasury spending account, would not be inflationary. And the reason why is because it's just sitting in the account. It just sends the message, hey, we're not running out of money. Hey, we can pay off the whole federal debt when it falls due. Hey, we can cover all the emergencies and all the natural disasters, which is good because we're going to have an increasing amount of those. And they're going to be increasingly expensive in the years to come because the turning point's already been reached. And, well, these things are just going to happen until we bring things under control, if we ever do. So we need a lot of money in that account in order to handle those as they come up. We need to make the job easy for Congress. That is, so that they don't have to worry about the money being in the account. All they have to do is appropriate the spending so the Treasury is free to spend that money. That's in the account. In other words, they would have already created the funding through the platinum coin law, which was implemented and used by Donald Trump producing the 100T coin. But now, to complete the funding process, Congress would have to untie the purse strings. So I tried to cut down the job just to the untying of the purse strings through appropriation bills and the mandating of spending, but through the appropriation bills. And so I think that should inform you too. That's not the only way to do it. It's not the cleanest way to do it. The cleanest way to do it is just for Congress to pass an appropriation bill and instruct the Federal Reserve to fill the Treasury spending account with the amount of the appropriation. And to do that with all appropriation bills for natural disasters, for Social Security, for whatever Congress is appropriating at the time. That should be the way it routinely does things. But if it doesn't want to do that, then the platinum coin solution to place that money there to relieve Congress of the responsibility of actually ordering the Fed to create those funds inside of the Treasury account, I thought that would expedite matters.
Yes, it would. It would.
And it would also place a salutary pressure on the Congress by removing the excuse of, we're running out of money from them. They couldn't very well use that excuse with all that money sitting in the Treasury account.
That's true.
And of course, the Treasury Department would never need to issue debt instruments again. So it would be clear, okay, it would be clear at that point that the overnight rates could still be controlled by the Federal Reserve through the Federal Reserve paying interest on reserves, which it already does to some extent at this point. It pays some very low interest on reserves, lower than what the debt instruments, okay, of the Treasury Department specify, okay, at any time. Those interest rates on short-term debt instruments now are very, very low also, but they are higher than the interest rates which the Fed is paying on reserves. So if the Fed wanted to have a higher federal funds rate, it would just have to increase the interest it is paying on the reserves that are sitting in the Fed. But, that would be up to it. And then people would not be talking about a public debt anymore. That's the advantage. It's a political advantage.
Yeah.
It's a political issue being taken off the table. And that's the purpose of it.
And at the same time, the people in Puerto Rico would be in a state of recovery and not in a state of extreme need right now. But what they've gone through is horrific. And
they would be in a recovery state, and the money would be flowing very, very freely.
Yes, sir.
If there was no rationale for Congress to limit the recovery funds. So I'll stop speaking for a while and let you ask another question.
Well, I've absorbed a lot of information tonight. Okay. I'm going to go back and replay this video and take notes, and the one that we had before too, Joe, and study those and study the conversations and what you spoke of versus my comments, so that one, I can start getting this done, and then I know where I want to take my campaign. I know where my campaign's going. I'm staying on message for the people and making sure that the needs of the people are taken care of.
Yes, I noticed that.
Sir?
I noticed that you're staying on message.
And I want to make sure that, I don't really give a damn how much it costs, okay? Because ever since Ronald Reagan, we've had trickle-down economics. And I feel that we as American people have been robbed. I've watched unions be decimated. I watched aircraft, at airports, the air traffic controllers fired. I watched a lot of things happen in my life, as I know you have too. And those are things that we have lost. And those are things that have decimated our middle class. Watching NAFTA take place and jobs go overseas. Yes, I know it's in the Rust Belt. Yes, I know that there were a lot of hazardous chemicals and things of this nature, that there are hazardous waste sites. And I know that our aquifers are being poisoned. And we need to, as a government, we need to make sure that we stop that and hold those who are responsible accountable. And I don't care how much money it costs them at all. But I want to make sure that our government does what is needed for the people. If it's education, if it's healthcare, if it's a lower military, if it means cutting subsidies to different groups of people and different types of corporations and manufacturers and suppliers, then I want to do that. And I want to see the American people start having that dream again that I had when I was a young man. Up until I was 55 years old, I even believed then that I wasn't finished working. That I was going to continue working like my father up until he was 75, or more. I mean, he came out of retirement just so he could work because he was bored with retirement. And so, you know, that's the kind of things that that's what I have built into me to keep doing. And, but now I see Americans struggling. I've watched wages be frozen, and I've seen, things taken from us. I've seen cost of living for Social Security. I've seen the Veterans Administration badmouth. I've seen the Postal Office just. So, I mean, there's a lot of things, and those things have to be changed. And I'm going to tell you right now, Joe, I won't vote on anything that's going to harm one citizen in this nation. I don't care how good it is for Washington. I will not vote against another individual's livelihood or ability to sustain their family. I mean, if there's not something written in there that brings them, some type of relief, it's not worth it. I mean, I think that a bill should be a bill and one bill only. I mean, I know that there's politics involved, but I'm just sick and tired of it. So, all right, let me step down off that soapbox here.
Okay. Well, I'm going to say something in reply to that. Okay.
Okay.
When you pass a bill that takes away the livelihood of the hedge funders, you may be having to hurt 1 or 2 or 20 or 25 people.
Oh, those people I'm not worried about, especially when it comes to Puerto Rico.
Okay, so that's what I mean, that when you legislate, there's always going to be somebody who is going to be hurt, because there are always trade-offs, and there are always costs, and there are always people whose individual interests are going to be disadvantaged, okay, by what you pass. So the objective is always to pass legislation in terms of your best estimate of what the public purpose is, taking all these different things into account. And once you've done that, I think you've done the best, okay, that you can do. And then you have to accept what those costs are in terms of disadvantaging certain other people. Okay, I guess that's the best, okay, that we can hope for. But we also have to be prepared to draw the line in certain instances. In other words, to note that when violence and real harm, okay, is being done to certain people, that such bills, okay, are off limits. They just cannot be passed under any circumstances.
Exactly.
Okay, there was some further remarks by Stephen Hale, okay, who is also one of ours, okay, and that's true both in the general sense and also in the MMT sense. And he made a couple of other comments that I want to show you, okay, at this point. His first was that it is not so much that inflation is a constraint as a signal that real constraints are being breached. And I certainly agree with that. If ecological resources are managed so that the depletion of non-renewables is ended, and renewables are priced for sustainability, then ecological factors join the real constraints, the exceeding of which trigger an increase in the price level. And I quite agree with that comment. Okay. And then we got another comment from him in which he said agreed, but probably because somewhere in all the words I said, I probably said essentially the same thing as what he said in his comment just before this one. So that's probably what happened there. Okay, now I understand you'd like to leave, but because your wife has a snack ready for you, okay, or dinner ready for you, and you've absorbed a tremendous amount. Okay.
Well, no, I didn't know what my questions, I didn't know what else to ask you because that's so much.
Well, I have questions from a lot of other people.
Okay, and I'd like to hear them.
Questions or comments. Teresa Sanders says, isn't that what people are really talking about when they say inflation? Not a few percentage points, okay, but runaway inflation? I think the answer to that question, Teresa, is that people in the street don't have a very precise idea of what they mean by inflation. Okay, but I think everybody thinks there's a distinction between inflation and hyperinflation. Okay, or but essentially runaway inflation. Okay, but I also think there's a further distinction between what the economists might say is inflation, and also what a lot of people in the street happen to think of as inflation. Like during the 1970s, we didn't really have a lot of inflation by certain historical standards. It wasn't at all runaway inflation. We had inflation going up to 6% a year, sometimes to 9% a year. Okay. And then the next year, we'd back off spending a bit, and it would go down to 7% again, and 6% and 5%, things like that. It was going back and forth. Okay, but there was no really rapidly accelerating levels of inflation in the 1970s. But still, the American people thought of that as inflation. They certainly did. Okay, they were talking all the time about the misery quotient. Okay, they called it, or the misery index, which was the ratio of the unemployment rate to the increase in the price level, or the inflation rate. Okay, as they conceived it. Okay, the misery ratio or quotient, okay, or index. Could have been the opposite about that. I'm not sure that I formulated it, okay, exactly perfect, because I've forgotten about it. But the main point here is that people thought they were experiencing inflation when they were not even experiencing as much inflation in their sense as Turkey was having, okay, for years on end, in the situation, okay, that Randy Ray characterized as not very much inflation, okay, at all. So the way economists look at inflation and the way regular people look at inflation is rather different, okay? I think the big issue is whether wages are keeping pace with inflation. During Carter's administration, things were not so serious for him when the union movement was effective and was raising wages at roughly the same rates as prices were going up. People were feeling pretty good, okay, at that time. But when Paul Volcker came in and started raising the interest rates so high and placing pressure on business and lowering demand, leading to a lowering, okay, of wages, then workers became dissatisfied because the unions weren't able to compensate. And then when Reagan came in and started breaking the unions, then workers were very dissatisfied until Volcker took off those very high interest rates and freed the economy to start to to boom again. But even then, there were very high interest rates for quite some time. And Reagan was lucky because only in 1983 or 1984 did the economy give the appearance of a boom, just in time for the re-election campaign.
Yeah.
He was lucky the re-election campaign didn't take place in 1982. If it had, Carter would have won. Okay, he was lucky on at a number of levels. he was lucky that, the Iranian action to free the prisoners was such a fiasco. If it hadn't been, then Carter probably would have been reelected again, in 1980. So, he was lucky, on a number of fronts, including Carter's appointment of Paul Volcker as the chairperson of the Federal Reserve. What a stupid move. But Carter did it. And Reagan was lucky because that really benefited him. Anyway, next question. Teresa Sanders is, we want all of Bernie and Jill's platform. Well, there are a lot of us who want all of Bernie and Jill's platform. I'm afraid I want more than that. And I think David here, from what I've heard him say, wants more than that also. I'm not sure I can speak for you, David, but I think...
yes, I concur with that statement. I concur with that statement.
Okay, but I think if you watch just a few of David's shows, I think the impression will come to you that he wants more than that. Michael Reynolds says, Strider, my man, nice to see you on RP. There's hope. Okay, I guess Michael Reynolds is a friend of yours.
I believe Michael was on the show last night, and I believe Michael may have also put a link of one of my live feeds to Cairo 7, a local news station there in Seattle metro area. I think Michael was instrumental in posting that to Cairo 7. I think I thanked him too when I found out what he had done. But yes, sir, Joe. There's a lot of things that I want, and I'm tired of people saying things, and I'm tired of people lying, and I have no problem getting in someone's face. Okay, I have no problem with that. Maybe that's where I take after my family name, Strider. It means to challenge or to contend, and I try to live up to that name.
Well, it seems that very much of Bernie Sanders' congressional career has been like that. He, too, was not afraid to confront people and to speak against both them and the policies they favored, even from the beginning when he first came into the House.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And he continued in the Senate. He still found a way to collaborate with them on many amendments and to forward some of the things he wanted, at least part of the way, even in the midst of the neoliberalism. He was relatively effective considering how much people disliked the policy positions that he favored. Okay. But he was really remarkably successful considering that. Okay, Jennifer Spurlock says, vote for the policy, not the politician. If he or she is not willing to learn MMT, then they are out. Flip the house. Hashtag MMT or bust.
I'm not a politician. I mean, that's what some people are going to say about me. But I'm a public servant. I just wish that they that reside in Washington D.C. right now recognize themselves as public servants and not hands that grab fistful of cash.
Okay, so Teresa Sanders then says, but Puerto Rico could be anyway. Please make the distinction. I'm not sure what she means exactly.
Well, let me see if this is what you're talking about, Teresa. Puerto Rico has had before these hurricanes hit, they have had their education system decimated. They've had their healthcare system decimated by those people who came in under congressional approval and ability to go into Puerto Rico and give them loans and things of this nature to help them, which really didn't help them. And then when the payments came due, instead of even talking about Congress helping get a refinance or getting funds to help Puerto Rico take care of their education and health needs, private industry was setting in, and those hedge fund managers were doing that. And now Puerto Rico is devastated. There's nothing there. They have no healthcare system. They have no education system. It has to be rebuilt. And I think, in my opinion, private money needs to stay out of Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico is a commonwealth of this nation. We need to go in as a nation, our country, our leaders need to go in and rebuild our commonwealth. Those American citizens there, we need to go there and rebuild it better than it was before, period. I have nothing else to say. Rebuild it better than it was before. And any congressional representative or Senate representative that does not want to do that, goodbye. I'm going to see you out the door.
Okay, Jennifer Spurlock says, bottom-up economics, we can disappear unemployment.
Yes. For those who want to work, not everyone is going to work. Not everyone is going to want to work. There are those who are going to go off the grid and become Grizzly Adams. There are going to be those people. Not everyone's going to fit there, but we should have it available for everyone who wants to have employment.
How do you feel about a basic income for those who want to be Grizzly Adams?
Well, I think that if they come down off the hillside and they need some hardtack and some tobacco and some cans of beans, that should be provided to them with no problem. Okay, and then go back up on the mountain if they want to. Make sure that their health care is taken care of.
Okay, so you're for a certain amount of for a basic income, but for those who don't want to participate in the economy, okay, in the social economy.
Right. I think that, you know, some type of stipend, whether it be $10,000 or $12,000 a year, but something that would help them meet their basic needs if they chose not to get into the workforce. I'm not saying that everyone's going to want to do that. I know that I wish I could work, that I could get back to working, but you know, no one's going to hire me at my age. I don't care what my acumen is. There, you know, it's going to be hard for someone senior to get back into the workforce. But all I'm saying is that those people who want to get back into work and can work and provide and do contribute to their communities should be able to do so without having to refer to the Equal Employment Opportunities laws. They should be able to do that.
Okay, well, of course, if we pass the federal job guarantee, then you would be able to get back into the workforce.
Well, if you had that ability, I mean, some people don't. I know a lot of people who are disabled, just flat out, they can't. For whatever reason, they cannot. There's no way that they can function. And
Absolutely.
you know, if they need to be subsidized, you know, for all their housing and their medical and their nutritional needs, yes, so be it. They're American citizens, and they didn't choose that direction in life. It was cast upon them, and so we need to take care of them rather than thinking of ways to take away health care and medications and put them in a position of, do I die tonight or do I wait till tomorrow?
Yeah, I think our principle has to be we take care of our own.
Yes, sir.
And that
Absolutely.
sort of describes it, I think.
Yes.
Okay, so Mark Fabian says, we appreciate your sentiment, David. And Allison Drucker says, How do I keep forgetting that I now have a phone that supports live streams? Sheesh. Well, I'm not sure. I guess that was kind of an offhand comment.
Yeah.
Mark Fabian, double digits mortgage rates.
Yes, when we were talking about the 70s and all that, yes, there were double mortgage rates, predatory loaning and stuff of the nature. Yes, I
Yes, I
remember.
know. In fact, I experienced a double digit mortgage rate. Okay, I think the rate that I got my mortgage at in those years when I bought a house was 13%. Very heavy payments. Naturally. Okay, so let's go on to some other comments. Allison Drucker says she wishes she lived in Washington.
I wish you did too, Allison. So many people I've met, it'd just be, but to be quite honest with you, Washington's a really nice state, and we have a lot of really cool people here. I've been here for 20 years, and I love it.
Yeah, what happened to your two senators, though? I think they started out actually pretty good. And then over time, they sort of got into the monetary system fairly deeply, and they're both kind of off the reservation now.
They have. I have voted for both of them. And it was because it just seemed like this, they're the way they were headed and everything, it seemed like a good thing. But then come 2016, I woke up like many others. And I knew that what happened, with Club D and C being able to choose how they wanted to do their candidates and how they wanted to use our votes against our vote, what we voted for, I realized that I couldn't be part of that anymore. And yeah, that's why I mentioned Maria Cantwell. We celebrate the same birthday, by the way, too. She was born October 13th, and I'm October 13th as well. And I've been tried to get her to go out with a cup of coffee so we could sit down and talk about the issues, but I know that she won't. I'm not worried about it. I'm 6 years her senior. It doesn't mean that I'm smarter than her, but perhaps I have a little bit. Washington has legal recreational cannabis. Yes, it does, and medical as well. One of these days, Joe, we're going to have to talk about the legalization of marijuana. I know that it's coming up. It's coming up in my live feeds. It's going to be coming up in my live feeds because of Attorney General. What's his name?
Jeff Sessions.
Yes, you see how important he is to me. Except that he's
the Klansman.
Yes, I didn't recognize him without his sheet. But I was approached by a Grand Dragon back in Ohio, and I told him, I says, no, sir, I don't think I'd fit into your club because my choice in friends and women are a little darker than what you accept. And my wife she's Thai, so I know I couldn't fit into that club. And I just wonder how Mitch McConnell fits into that same club because his wife is Korean. I just wonder how he fits into that club. But Jeff Sessions, I'm sure he's going to remember me. Cannabis, 1978. Can I say something about my history, Joe?
Sure.
Can I say something about my history?
Sure, go ahead.
1978, Marine Corps David L. Strider petitioned the North Carolina Drug Commission for therapeutic use of medical marijuana.
Oops.
During the course of that year in 1978, I was an active duty Marine. I worked with the Piedmont Judicial Circuit, Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. I scheduled court martials. I sat in the judge's chambers. I was one of 5 selected Marines that were going to be prosecutors, sent through law school via the Marine Corps because of my academics and my level of competency. That was in 1977, but I was one of those 5. And when I worked in the judiciary, Joe, I was with some of the finest men and women. And, but I also saw Marines go and get bad conduct discharges because of marijuana possession, trace amounts. And I knew that I had to say something. And I would occasionally offhandedly say something to, in the presence of the judges. I wouldn't particularly bring out a particular case or accused or anything of that nature. I just mention it in general. And I realized that I had to do something. And I used marijuana for medical reasons. And so I petitioned the North Carolina Drug Commission just for that use. Now, I was arrested in North Carolina with 150 plants at my home. And the sheriff from Monzo County wanted to talk to me. He didn't shoot my dogs who were barking at him and all of his deputies. He says, "David, can you calm down your dogs?" And I went, and the dogs sat and left the deputies alone. Remind you, the dogs were trained by a Marine. And so they said, "Yeah, Dave, we'd like to talk to you about," and he looked at it, he says, "that right there." And I had a wheelbarrow in my living room at the time with about 5 or 6 marijuana plants in it. And he said, "Yeah, we'd like to talk to you." I said, "Do you have a warrant, Sheriff?" He says, "Yes, we do." I said, "Well, one thing you could mention is that if you come into this home, there's nothing here but marijuana products. Anything else does not belong here." Well, after they left and they took me to jail, they asked me if I needed cigarettes, and we stopped and they bought me a couple packs of cigarettes. I was treated very nice. Okay. I was on TV. I was on radio. I was in newspapers. I was removed from the judiciary activity. Okay. And I told the commanding general I had requested mass to where I could speak with my commanding officer, Marine Corps Base, Camp Lejeune. And he says, "Well, what do you want me to do, Sergeant?" He said, "If I order you to stop, would you stop?" And I respectfully told him, I said, "Sir, I would hope that you would never give me that order." I surrendered at that time a career in the Marine Corps, in the judiciary activity. I gave that up because I saw other Marines being damaged by a bad conduct discharge because of a trace amount of marijuana. They would take off, and because of the marijuana possession, they were able to be bumped up from office hours, non-judicial punishment, which is like a traffic court, all the way up to a federal court, military court, and try to get a job with a bad conduct discharge.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I was able to leave the Marine Corps with an honorable discharge with full benefits. Honorable discharge from the Marine Corps with full benefits. I told my commanding general that I would like to resign because the news and everything else that was happening to the Marine Corps, which I dearly love, was not what I had planned. It's not what I hoped for. And that's how I got out of the Marine Corps. I left the Marine Corps. And I think that sometimes in some of my speaks and everything else, Joe, people will realize that, the Marine Corps is very much a part of me and those who serve. And I believe that some of the UCMJ was also modified and changed. Article 134 and Article 94 regarding marijuana usage. There was amended to where those Marines or service people that were caught in possession of it could receive treatment or were summarily discharged out with an administrative discharge and not a bad conduct discharge, but where treatment was also made available to them. I made some enemies. That's okay. But I think I helped save some Marines as well. And so that mission accomplished in that respect. And now 40 years later, North Carolina is looking at medical marijuana. 40 years after my
there are many states that are doing that, and the more the medical experiments go on, the more evidence comes out that marijuana is very medically beneficial, okay, in many cases, and that it also has really very few side effects. It certainly is nothing like the tobacco, okay, or alcohol.
And one thing I will say, I'd like to add on caveat into what I've been saying is that when I go out with my friends, I am the designated driver. I want to make sure that my friends get out and have a good time, and that they get home after having a good time. I am the designated driver. I am their chauffeur for the night, and kind of like their chaperone, so to speak. But they don't know it because they're having so much fun, and I'm having a good time too because my friends are having a good time. I'm with friends and everything else. But
okay, let me
go ahead.
Okay, if I can, okay, I'd like to shift the subject, okay, a little.
All right.
Thank
you for letting me say that, Joe. Thank you for letting me say that. I know it's going to come out sooner or later. It might as well come out sooner than later. They tried to use that against me in 1991, 92 when I ran for mayor in a small little town that had maybe 300 voters total.
Okay, I don't think that is much of a problem today because too many people know the truth.
I never made a dime off it, too, by the way.
Okay, Mark Fabian had a question, which is about Social Security.
Yes.
Okay, wanted to expand Social Security again, SSI to cover. I think what he was talking about was to more than cover the basic income, to give a good retirement to people, so they could live in a decent way, okay, in their retirement. And I think he wants to know your position on that.
Well, until I'm able to get in and facilitate that change, Mark, I know what it's like for people to live on Social Security and Social Security disability, okay? And we do need something better. The expansion of Social Security, Social Security recipients got, I went up $3 on my Social Security benefit per month, $3. And over the course of the year, that's less than a tank of gas, and that's buying it at Costco. And I drive an EV. So, I mean, yes, Social Security, the cost of living has not moved. The cost of living has not increased at all. And so, yes, if the cost of living had increased with Social Security to where it would cover some of this, yes. But Social Security and Social Security benefits are not covering the retirees or that person disabled. It's not covering their needs, period. It's not covering their needs at all. And it needs to be expanded. And that guaranteed income could be tacked on in addition to what their Social Security or SSI would be.
Right. Okay, so that is your position on it. I'm wanting now to explore some of the positions, okay, that you have.
Okay.
Catherine Tokarska says we have to get rid of student loan debt, and she thinks that's a must.
I think so too, and I think it can be done very easily. It was done for me. My student loan debt was dismissed because of my veteran status. And so I don't see why it cannot be done for those young men and women out there who are trying to get jobs in the fields and those students still trying to get through school. They shouldn't be worrying about the debt. They should be worrying about their field of study so that they can focus and know that they're going to be the best at what they're going to be doing and not some student debt and when they're going to pay it off. But I think, yes, they need to get rid of student debt. Yes, period. And I'll do everything I can to do that. And I'm not talking Dixie here. I'm talking about going there and doing it. And I got people like Joe to help me.
Well, you might have a lot of other people from here helping you also.
That's what I said. I got people like you and Joe and other people, you know. It can get done, Catherine.
Okay, so, Mark says, I meant to cover those unable and unwilling. to join a federal job guarantee.
There are going to be people who cannot, that will not, that for whatever reason. I mean, there are people with Ronald Reagan got rid of our National Institute of Health. Yeah, I mean, we had a lot of people that were in healthcare, mental health care units, and it seemed like that's when the Bluetooth era began. Because when I was living in New York City, there was a lot of people that were standing out and they were talking and everything, but they weren't talking, they were talking to the crowds. But in today's, to now in 2017, you don't think nothing of it as somebody talking loud on a city corner or whatever, because, oh, they got a Bluetooth. But the early people who were doing that were probably just out or needed mental health in many cases, many mental health care. And they weren't getting it because it wasn't available to them. And so there are going to be people like that that fall into that criteria, or are unable to work, or can't work, or just need something that they're not getting right now. And it could be through the healthcare system that they're able to get the relief that they need. But then they're going to need some form of monetary system to keep them viable, help them recover.
Okay, I think so. Mark is talking about Social Security and SSI expanded to cover the federal job guarantee, okay, in lieu of a basic income.
I think that until you reach that age of Social Security, I mean, if you want to use Social Security for that, that's one thing. But I think that if there's somebody out there that's actually still working and stuff, I think it'll be a little hard to roll that Social Security and SSI expanded into that. I think the jobs bill, 100% employment rate, if they wanted to, I think that has a good leg to stand on. But increasing the Social Security and the SSI, there'll be a lot of obstruction in trying to see that pass. Whereas a jobs bill, what we talked about earlier, and what might
be. I think what Mark is asking is what you would favor, regardless of the opposition, okay, that you got from other people. In other words, what's your judgment about
the
right policy to pass?
Yeah, short and simple, expand Social Security and Social Security SSI, supplemental income, but at the same time, push the other through basic income, everything, push it through, because just tack that basic income, any increase that a basic income would have, throw that into the Social Security mix as well, because it's going to have to be something that's going to go in there. I mean, you can't get by on $12,000 a year, period.
Okay, I would just sort of add here that a position I've seen expressed from some of the MMTers, which sounds very sensible to me, is that there should be the job guarantee program. Okay, and then there should also be a basic income for people who were not in the job guarantee program, which might well be administered through the Social Security system as part of Social Security, essentially rolled into Social Security and not be an entirely separate program, and be set at a subsistence level. So people would be able to live under that, okay, but that there would be a differential between the living wage under the job guarantee and the basic income that would have been rolled into the Social Security program.
And it all starts with our Social Security card too, Joe, because that right there pretty much ties us into anything. It's just a matter of what what your level of security is that you can get into the different programs, but everything is tied in. Our Social Security number is tied into everything. So I could see where that, what you just said, I could see where that could be rolled into something like that and made to work.
Okay, Catherine Tokarska says something very relevant also here. She says, you can't afford rent with Social Security. And if you own your own home free and clear and get seriously sick, correct me if I'm wrong, they take your house.
They look at assets that you have. I know that I've had friends, people that I know in my life who divorced and everything, and so that the one spouse that got seriously ill, they wouldn't lose everything. And that's what the ACA was supposed to protect, so that we didn't lose those assets, so that we could still have the health care that we needed and not worry about losing our home that we lived in. Because if the spouse is still healthy, why should she or he lose the home because his partner got ill?
Yeah, well, of course,
raise that.
Broader question, okay, the broader question of the justice of this, okay, is answered by the Medicare for All program. In other words, if we pass the Medicare for All program, then this would not happen.
Exactly.
Okay, because of the cost for medical services would be free at the point of service.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, in other words, taking into account that there might or might not be some tax increases, okay, associated with this, and I think it could be legislated without any tax increases, and that would be the best way to legislate it. Okay, but even if there was some, then there still wouldn't be this situation where you've incurred serious medical bills, okay, through no fault of your own, okay, and your house, okay, is up for grabs. Bernie Sanders' bill would eliminate that. That would not exist anymore. John Conyers' bill would eliminate that and would not exist anymore. So that's something we get rid of with the Medicare for All program. I think it's something we really need to have.
Yes.
Okay, I see the live comments are now winding down. We haven't gotten any new ones for a while. And we've been on for 2 hours and 23 minutes, David.
Wow.
Which is not a record, but is getting close. I think this has been a very good conversation. We've explored a lot of what you want to do, and I think people have a clear impression of what you stand for. And I think they're going to be continuing to watch you, okay, and perhaps some of them are hoping very much that you have success in your Senate campaign. Okay, because as far as I know, or as far as I can see, you'd make a considerable improvement for the U.S. Senate over Maria Cantwell.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe.
That's it. So anyway, I trust we'll be talking again from time to time.
Yes, sir, we will.
I'm certainly willing to do this again.
And I just like to put out one more statement, Joe. If for some reason you ever hear me say something that is not what you thought I was going to say, I want you to call me on the carpet, and I'm asking you now to make sure that, and you demand clarification on something that I have said. I want to make sure that when I speak the truth, and that's all you hear from me. And I thank you, everyone, with the comments and the questions. I appreciate that. And Joe, thank you and Real Progressives for having me on tonight.
Okay, before I say goodnight, okay, I would like to say to everybody that I have a website. It's at josephmfirestone.com. Okay, my books, okay, are all there and are discussed there. And I have some blog posts that appear there from time to time. And I have 2 blog posts that appeared there in the last 2 days. And I also have a link to my Patreon account there. And I'd appreciate it if occasionally you would be able to make a contribution to that account, because I've been doing this now for 7 years, but basically on an entirely charitable basis. And I'm beginning to feel a need to at least have some support for my extensive efforts on behalf of MMT and public purpose. So thank you very much, and thank you very much also for attending, and thank you, David, for your conversation.
You're welcome, Joe.
Okay, I certainly appreciate it all.
And if they all can get out there and visit your page and chip in on that Patreon account that you have, and donate to your continued work that you're doing for individuals like me, I encourage everyone to get out there and do that.
Okay, thank you, David.
You're welcome, sir.
And I encourage everyone to help you as well.
Appreciate that. I appreciate that.
Okay, good night, all. And remember, my regular Saturday night program is coming up tomorrow night. I'm not entirely sure yet what the topic will be. I've been thinking of some things, and I'll be announcing that probably relatively early in the day tomorrow. So thanks very much for being here again, and good night. I'm going to end the broadcast now.